So as we talk about employee handbooks then and looking from a mission statement, we find that the mission of the handbook is the embodiment of the organization's values and culture. So perhaps a little bit different than we used to think about handbooks, of just providing work rules. We're now expressing the values and cultures of the organization. And to do that, then, we look at providing an indication of the tone at the top. And that's a phrase that's used by the Institute of Internal Auditors, telling employers, telling organizations that senior management has to be involved. Senior management has to share and express what's important to them, what is going to be important to the organization, and that has to be clear. And so employee handbooks now need to express this tone at the top, which means that in the creation of your employee handbook, senior management needs to be involved, needs to add their 2 cents into the creation of the handbook. And so important then as you're drafting or you're updating your handbook that you get senior management's involvement. And so an important issue for you. It also will help choreograph day-to-day employee activities and interaction. So this is the day-to-day activities between the employees and the supervisor, between issues that employees face every day, and you increasingly need to share both the organization's perspective, share work rules, share legal obligations that the employer has. And so the handbook now plays and continues to play an important role in providing this type of information to employees. Someplace they can look to perhaps initially and then identify where they need to go next. Thirdly, what we find is that handbooks play an important role in demonstrating the organization's commitment to a culture of compliance. And this is something that comes from 10 years ago when we had the recession. And federal law now requires that for publicly traded companies that you do this, that you talk about the code of ethics that the organization has and is required of employees. And so this culture of compliance now is an additional part of the handbook that needs to be addressed and you need to communicate to your employees. So as a result, then, we look at employee handbooks as formalizing expectations. And what I mean by that is that it describes what your organization expects from your employees, and additionally, what employees should expect from you. So it's not just one-sided now. And increasingly what we see and organizations are facing as millennials come into their organization, they want to see not only what they have to do, what they owe you as the employer, but what they can expect from you. And so the handbook now adds an additional activity for you to do in communicating with your employees. So as a result then, as we look at then employee handbooks, we see there are both positive and negatives that we'll have to address. And so there's this double-edged sword as we talk about handbooks. So handbooks that are aligned with strategic and business objectives that are properly drafted and effectively implemented do some things. First of all, they enhance the employment brand. And this is interesting because it used to be, not that long ago, that the employment brand was really not an issue for many employers. They weren't sure what that meant. They really didn't pay attention to it. The employee handbook was just something they handed out to employees, their employees the first day of work after they went through all their paperwork. And whether or not the handbook encouraged and had a positive feature on the employer really wasn't an issue. That's now changed. The employee handbook does have can have a positive feature, have a positive effect on the employer. And so employers are looking at employee handbooks from that perspective. As a result, then, it plays a key role in the recruitment and retention of employees. As I said, increasingly, millennials are coming into the workplace, and rather than waiting to look at the handbook for the first time when they decide to join your organization, they're increasingly now asking for a copy of the handbook to help them make their decision whether they want to come to work for you. So the handbook now takes on perhaps a marketing role that you're now trying to trying to convince individuals, employees, to join your organization. And so a new relationship now with employee handbooks from perhaps a marketing perspective. And of course, once you have employees working for you, and again, millennials we don't expect them to spend 10 or 20 or 30 years with us. We're often looking at 3 to 5 years. So there's this retention activity, and we're looking at things that will help the organization improve the retention of key employees, and that's another role for the handbook to do. So there's something in writing where the employer says, this is what we're going to do for you as the employee, and so this is an important feature now of the expectation of employee handbooks. Third, we see that there's an enhanced employee relations, employee morale, and productivity issue that need to be addressed. And so we're looking at these issues, and again, where do we provide information to our employees, perhaps to our supervisors, about what we expect from our employees. And the employee handbook can play an important role in communicating those issues and that message. It can also then contribute to a uniform and consistent application, interpretation, and enforcement of organization policies and rules. So all organizations have developed policies and rules that are required of their workforce, of their employees, perhaps of their independent contractors. And so how do you communicate it? Where do you communicate it? And of course, you may want to communicate it in a number of locations and a number of times, but the starting point often for the communication of work rules and organizational policies is the employee handbook. So the employee handbook then continues to play an important role. And this is one of the original purposes of handbooks, but it continues. Perhaps it's expanded more than it used to be. But it's an important role then for you as you think about your organization rules, policies, procedures, of communicating it to employees, and one way of doing that is through your employee handbook. Next is going to protect the organization against claims of improper employee supervisory conduct. Well, we know that on a day-to-day basis, our employees and our supervisor have the closest relationship. Often the management won't get involved at all with employee relations, but supervisors do. And so often then we want to make sure that both supervisors and employees understand what the relationship is, understand what the work rules are, and so the employee handbook can play an important role in providing that information to both supervisors and employees. And then finally, we look to the employee handbook as a source of reducing the organization's exposure to employment-related claims and liabilities. So we know that happens all the time that an individual, an employee, is dissatisfied either with their supervision, with management, with their benefits, with something about their employment, and in the past perhaps they just lived through it, and so for the previous generations they'd live and complain and maybe complain to themselves. That's not true of particularly millennials. They're either going, if they're highly rated, if they have other access to other employment, they'll just leave. And perhaps never tell you what's bothering them. Or perhaps they'll file a claim against you or file some sort of complaint against your organization. And so you want the handbook then to put your organization in the best position to respond to and protect it against potential liability. So some significant roles then for the handbook. But unfortunately, not all handbooks are designed that way, and often they're misaligned, improperly drafted, or ineffectively implemented, so they have a negative effect on these key issues. So they'll undermine the employment brand that we talked about, this positive effort to encourage employees in the marketplace. The handbook will often mislead employees about what's important and misdirect employees about what action they should take. So again, often employees will look to the handbook in a new situation for some guidance on what they should do. And if your handbook hasn't covered that issue, or perhaps provide the wrong information, your employees may follow that. And so we need to be careful in developing the employee handbook that we address key issues and we provide the proper information that they should take. It can also then reduce employee commitment and engagement. So where you don't properly communicate, where you don't make employees understand that they are an important part of your organization, then their commitment and engagement with your organization will be reduced. And of course, that means your organization then doesn't live to the higher level that you're trying to achieve. It will also have an impact of increasing the risk of employment-related claims and lawsuits, and possibly included systemic violations. Where employees are dissatisfied, again, they can leave or they can file claims against you. In some cases, it's not single claims, but perhaps multiple claims. And so ensuring that your handbook is positive can help reduce this factor. And as a result, then, it also, negative handbooks then increase your organization's vulnerability to third-party intervention. So not only do you have individual employees filing claims against you, but you may actually have third parties. You may show up in social media, so you may have other organizations, other individuals now looking at least perhaps looking at your organization negatively, or perhaps filing claims against your organization. So not having a properly drafted handbook can cause your organization significant problems. So as a result of that, we look at employee handbooks to provide the organization with the opportunity to do something, to do important things. And so one of the things we're looking at the handbook to do is to enhance the value of their human capital. And so as we talk now about our employees, I want to start using the term human capital, because when we talk about employees, if you think of, for those of you with a finance background or perhaps accounting, you know your income statement has three important elements. It has sales, which is the money coming in. It has expenses, which is the amount of money going out, and that leaves profitability. And so if you want to address the profitability, you have to either increase sales or reduce expenses. And that's been the typical target, the typical process of organizations, particularly as a result of employees, where let's keep the amount of the expense that we spend on employees to the minimum because that will reduce profitability. But now we're looking at employees differently. Now they're not only an expense item, but they can be an asset. They can contribute to the value of the organization's human capital, which means it contributes to the value of the organization. And so, importantly, as we think about the employee handbook, we need to think of our employees now, again, not only as an expense item, but as a contributor to the value of the human capital, which is an asset. So a different way of thinking about employees now. Also, we need to make the organization and think about making the organization more competitive. Most organizations now have are not monolithic. Often they have a number of competitors, both locally, regionally, perhaps nationally, in some cases globally. And so as they face this competition, they're looking at factors that will help make them more competitive, and their employees play an important role from that perspective. And so as we think about making the organization more competitive, we need to think about making our employees more competitive, which means making them more satisfied with the organization. So there's this connection between our ability to compete and how we treat our employees. And again, the employee handbook can play an important role in that from that perspective. We also look at improving individual and organizational performance. So going along with the competition then is that how do we make individuals their performance higher? How do we encourage them to achieve higher goals? Because when they do that, then that's going to have a positive impact on the organization. So often then our employee handbook then is adding to this feature of improving organization and individual performance. It also has an important value in helping the organization improve their human capital risk profile. So from a strategic level, and those of you who are involved in strategic HR at a strategic level, you recognize that your organization faces a number of risks. And risk management now is a strategic issue. And one part of that risk activity is human capital risk. And so controlling and managing human capital risk, taking advantage of the risk that's created, adds to the value of the organization. And so something else we need to address in the employee handbook. And of course, all this then is designed, to help your organization achieve its business goals and objectives. And so when we get through with the handbook is not just to provide information. It's really designed, in addition, to help your organization achieve specific objectives and goals. And so when you put it in that term, those terms, you see that the organizational, your individual handbook plays an important role in not only where you are, but where your organization is going. So conversely, though, if we don't have a properly drafted handbook, it can do some negative, have some negative activity for our organization. First of all, it can impede the achievement of business objectives. So we just talked about how important that is, and if your handbook isn't designed to encourage employees, to provide employees with the proper material and resources, then that's going to reduce the achievement of your business objectives. It's also going to potentially increase employment-related liabilities. And so where employees are dissatisfied, they may file claims against you, and they may actually use the handbook to support their position about why they feel they were mistreated. And then finally, we find that if your handbook is improperly drafted, it will reduce your organization's managerial prerogatives by making promises or commitments to certain procedures and safeguards that the organization did not intend to make. So you need to think through from the very beginning, before you hire employees, what is your organization trying to do? What commitments are you going to make? What do you want to tell your supervisors and recruiters during the hiring process? All this goes together, and you want to make sure then that your handbook doesn't create misinformation about what your organization is trying to do, the commitment it's going to make. Maybe you need to review your commitments periodically to make sure you're providing the right activity, but you certainly don't want to create misimpressions about what your organization is going to do for your employees, because that's going to create new liabilities and new grief for you and your supervisors. So you need to make sure then that the commitments you're making are properly designed and determined and discussed in your employee handbook. So as we talk then about the evolution of employee handbooks, sort of where we've been and where we are now and where we're going, we see that the purposes and value of employee handbooks are changing. So as I mentioned, this is more than just a document that's handed out the first day when a new employee comes to our employment. We make them fill out paperwork, so they can get paid and maybe sign up for for pensions or other activities. And then we give them an employee handbook and we give it to them and say, okay, read this over, and if you have any questions, come to the HR or see your supervisor. And generally the thought has been that the individual will take the handbook, bring it to their desk or to bring it home and not look at it again. But that's changing. The handbook now is something that is being looked at, as I mentioned before, the individual actually joins the organization, and then after they come to work, and something we're trying to encourage them to do. So our handbook needs to then make sure that it's providing them with that opportunity to actually look at the handbook and to answer questions for them. We're also finding that the number of customers and stakeholders in handbooks are growing. So it's more than now, as we talk about handbooks, it's more than just employees. We're looking at applicants. We're looking at third parties. We'll talk about this in a minute, some of the other groups and individuals looking at employee handbooks. But the handbook is now much wider, visible, has much greater understanding and use, and so we need to be careful now in both the design and what's included in the handbook. As a result, then, we find that the size and complexity of handbooks are expanding. It used to be when we did an employee handbook for a client, maybe it was 25 pages, and it covered the basic work rules that the employer wanted. It covered perhaps wage and hour issues, and that was the purpose of the employee handbook. Well, employee handbooks now include a variety of things, and they're much larger. As a matter of fact, we just completed a handbook for a client that was 95 pages. Significant complexity now. With the work rules and the mission of the employer. Something new to be thinking about as you're reviewing your handbook, as you're perhaps thinking about updating or expanding it, to think about now these new issues. We also find the development process is becoming more dynamic and more inclusive. So often when we used to do employee handbooks, it was meeting with the Human Resource Department and having the Human Resource Department do the handbook, maybe have it reviewed by their legal counsel, and then distributing the handbook. That's changed, and one that we encourage employers now when we do employee handbooks. We now, because of everything we've been discussing, we now encourage that the employee handbook has the CEO involved, has the CFO involved, has general counsel involved, has managers and supervisors from online involved, perhaps the risk manager involved, maybe your compliance manager involved, along with human resources, and then the internal auditing staff involved, because we want to have a handbook that actually addresses these issues. So often now, rather than the human resource person going back to their office and spending a week behind closed doors doing their handbook, we now are having multiple meetings, maybe 5 or 6 meetings with the group to talk about the employee handbook, looking at it, evaluating it, and that's the process now. So handbooks now have become a much different issue than just communicating work rules. And then additionally, we have then, of course, governmental activity, looking at what employers are doing. And this, to some extent, goes back to 2016, under the previous administration, President Obama's National Labor Relations Board issued a general memorandum about employee handbooks. And they held that employers need to be much more careful about handbooks and how handbooks actually affect employees and employers. So that was 2016, and then of course, just as that was beginning to affect employers, we had the election. President Obama, or President Trump now, has appointed a new National Labor Relations Board, and they have changed and updated this General Counsel's memorandum. So now there's a new guidance on employees, and it's referred to as guidance on handbook rules post-Boeing. And Boeing was a case then that was involved in employee handbooks. So under the National Labor Relations Board Act, we find that they've established a new standard that focuses on the balance between the rule's negative impact on employees' ability to exercise their Section 7 rights, and this is the Section 7 right of the National Labor Relations Act, and the rule's connection to employers' right to maintain discipline and productivity in the workplace. So what does all that mean? Well, it means now that the National Labor Relations Board is still reviewing employee handbooks. And so what it says is now that under this new guidance, there is now a balance. A handbook has a now balancing test, at least balancing a little bit differently than the previous board looked at it. And that it significantly alters the jurisprudence on determining the reasonable interpretation of handbook rules. It specifically now notes that work rules that specifically ban protected concerted activity remain unlawful, and the application of facially neutral rules against employees engaged in protected concerted activity also remain unlawful. So as we think of the National Labor Relations Act and the National Labor Relations Board, and it's Section 7 of the Act, we think about, well, okay, that's for union members. Only 8% of the national workforce is now union. So for the vast majority of you, perhaps all of you, well, we don't have to worry about that because it applies to unions. Well, it's true. The National Labor Relations Act does apply to union, but it also affects and applies to non-union employers and non-union employees. And so this guidance now is true for all employers and something you need to pay attention to. So what did the new guidance do? Well, it now looks at the guidance under 3 categories. And so as you're thinking about your employee handbook, here's now what you need to think about. Category 1 is rules that are generally lawful to maintain. So this is now the positive effect on on employers. So these are things that are now positive from your perspective, from employer's perspective, that you can now do. So first of all, you can have now civility rules. So you can prohibit name-calling, gossip, rudeness, and you are now allowed to do that. Under the previous rules, perhaps not. There were some areas that you were not allowed to do. But now you can do that. So as you look at your handbook and update your handbook, you can now have civility rules. You can also have no photography rules and no recording rules. So you may prohibit employees from recording conversations, phone calls, images, or company meetings with a recording device without your approval. So you can say you can't do that. That wasn't necessarily true under the previous guidance, but you can now prohibit employees from doing that. You can also prohibit employees from recording telephone or other conversations they have with coworkers, managers, or other third parties unless those recordings are approved in advance. So this is something else you can do now that prohibits employees from doing this activity. Third, Rule C, rules against insubordination, non-cooperation, or on-the-job conduct that adversely affects operations. So you can have a legitimate and substantial interest in preventing insubordination and non-cooperation at work. Something, well, that seems like a natural thing to do, was subject to perhaps some hesitation under the previous rules. You can also now have you now have the right to expect employees will perform their job and follow directives. Something else now. It seems natural to have this, but there was some perhaps disagreement from the previous rules. D, disruptive behavior. You can now have rules that that cover unprotected roughhousing, dangerous conduct, and bad behavior. Well, that seems like a natural thing you want to include, but it wasn't necessarily true. You cannot, though, have rules that apply to employees on strike or walkout. So if you have a union or you have employees involved in the strike or walkout, you cannot have rules prohibiting that. E, you can now have rules protecting confidential, proprietary, and customer information or documents. So you can impose rules that ban the discussion of confidential, proprietary, or customer information that makes no mention of employee or wage information. So as you're thinking about your confidentiality and things that are important to your organization, you can tell employees now that they cannot share this information, they cannot discuss confidential proprietary information with third parties. The only thing you can't do is limit discussion of employee wages. That's allowed under Title VII. Employees do not have the right to disclose employee information obtained from unauthorized access to or use of confidential records, or remove the records from employers' premises. So again, you have the right now to protect your information from employees' inappropriate use. And then finally, under Category 1, we have rules against defamation and misrepresentation, rules against using employer logo or intellectual property, rules requiring authorization to speak for the company, and rules banning disloyalty, nepotism, and self-enrichment. So you have these rights that are in this category that you can impose on your workforce, impose on your employees. And so that's an important advantage now that's been added at least under the current administration. Of course, we have a new election coming up. Who knows what happens under the next administration? But at least for now, this is something you can do. And so I said there were three categories. The second category, so the first category is rules that as an employer you can impose. The second category are rules that warrant individual scrutiny. So under this category, the rules are in this category. Your rules are neither lawful nor unlawful, and must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis to determine whether the rules would interfere with the rights guaranteed by the National Labor Relations Act. So what we're talking here about, the legality must often be determined in the context of the rules. So you cannot have then confidentiality rules that specifically limit the employee's discussion of wages, terms of employment, or working condition. You cannot have rules that prohibit disparagement or criticism of the organization, or you can't have rules that specifically ban participation in outside organization. So the first group of rules is something you can do. The second group of rules, well, okay, we're going to have to look at them on an individual basis and see whether or not you can impose these rules. And then the third set of rules are rules that are now have been determined to be unlawful. You cannot do this. So these are rules that are generally unlawful because they would prohibit or limit the National Labor Relations Act protected conduct and have an adverse impact on employees' rights that are guaranteed under the National Labor Relations Act. So things like confidentiality rules regarding wages, benefits, or working conditions, or rules against joining outside organizations or voting on matters concerning the employer. These are specifically rules that are unlawful, that you cannot impose. This gives you some sense then of the changes that have occurred. Significant rules have been now specifically addressed that allow you to do it and under Category 1. And so as you're reviewing your handbook, I think you need to pay attention to these to make sure then you cover these areas. So as we continue then, we find from a traditional handbook standpoint, as we've thought about employee handbooks in the past, and we found that they function as a communication tool to provide information to a passive audience, your employees. So as I mentioned, employees got a copy of the handbook when typically their first day of work, told to look at it, to read it. Sometimes they were asked to sign for it. And then perhaps you never heard about your handbook or work rules or from your employees again. That's been a very passive audience. And they have been relegated, typically from the creation standpoint, they've been relegated to human resources and the legal department to describe the workplace and working rules. So that's, the human resource person will go and do the handbook, perhaps show it to legal counsel, and then have the handbook printed up and distribute it. That was the process. And then also they've been used as a method to comply with employment law notices. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the ADA, the FMLA, the various federal work rules, you should communicate those with your employees, and often you'd put those in writing and include it in the handbook. So there'd be a section in the handbook about laws and regulations, and that's something you would do with the handbook. Interestingly, the only rule that needs to be in writing is the FMLA law. So that you have to provide communication if you provide a handbook. The other Title VII, the ADA, there's nothing requiring you to do that. It's a good idea to do it, but the legal requirement is only for the FMLA, but I think just generally you're going to include all these various laws and restrictions in your handbook. But as noted, the rules and these issues are now changing. An employee's handbook success, which has typically been measured in the level of HR efficiency and by meeting cost metrics, so that the HR department was told they need to get a new handbook out, and they'd have $10,000 to spend. And so if they spent $9,500, wow, they did a good job. They came in under budget. They're also told that they needed to get it done at a certain time. And so if that was done, and the percent of employees that received their handbook was 75%, that was positive. So the person in the human resource department has achieved their goals. Okay, so that's the way employee handbooks have been reviewed, evaluated as to whether or not they have been successful. But that's changing. The economy, competition for top talent, and dynamic changes in the workplace and workforce have increased the strategic value of human capital. So our starting point now is looking at employees not as an expense item now, but as human capital. Different perspective now. These factors have changed the emphasis of human resource management from expense control and risk mitigation to asset enhancement and return on investment. So now we're not only looking at employees as an expense item, but as an asset, and we're now beginning to look at return on investment, ROI. So many of you are familiar with ROI. Of course, for those in accounting and finance are already familiar with ROI. So we're now looking at this activity not only as an expense item, but the return on investment that we're making. So as a result, then, organizations increasingly have to do some things. They have to change the way they're doing what they've done. First of all, they need to expand the diversity of participants involved in the development. So as I mentioned, no longer just human resources. And when we do handbooks now, we have much broader participation, all from the CEO on down. You need to do that now in developing your employee handbook. You need to pay greater attention to the expanding number of potential employee stakeholders. So again, this is not only for employees, for applicants, for other third parties, and so that may change the narrative that you use, the terminology you use in your handbook, because now you have multiple users, and so you want to make sure your employees have the proper information, but also you have to think about who else is going to look at it and maybe change some of your what you include in it. You need to consider new formats of handbook design and new methods of distribution. So typically, as I noted, the handbook was distributed to the individual employee at the time of employment. And that was it. They had a hard copy, and you gave it to them, and then you met your obligation. Well, hard copy is still desired, still I consider a required part of the handbook process, but it's not necessarily enough. You need to now think about having the availability of handbook and the distribution of handbook through other methods, through social media, through your website, through other ways of communicating key rules from your handbook. So different perspective now on the distribution of employee handbooks and the messages included in the employee handbook. Also, you need to assess and measure the impact of employee handbooks on the employment brand and talent management activities. So you have this employee handbook. You've given it to your employee. Do you assess it? Do you measure the impact that it has on your employment brand, on talent management activity, on other human resource activities to determine whether or not you're hitting the mark, whether you're accomplishing what you had in mind? Just doing a handbook and giving it to the employee is no longer enough in measuring how the success of your handbook project. And you must assess and measure handbook contribution to achieving business objectives. And this is really the issue. So we first of all have now recognized that human resources has and is expected to have an impact on strategic and business objectives. And so what do they do? How does human resources affect the achievement of these goals? And the handbook then plays a role in that. So again, the handbook's role is changing as the human resource role changes. So as a result, then, your handbook needs to be updated and include new areas. So as we talk about handbooks and what's included in handbooks, then, one of the things we still look at is the handbook is the handbook now becoming a contract? And the answer is no. It should not become a contract. You need to be clear that this handbook is not a contract. That's been true all along. It hasn't changed, other than it's become it has continuing importance in making sure that message is communicated. That we're giving you a handbook, it has a lot of uses, but it does not create an employment contract. Additionally, we need to include in our handbook the revised employment and will statement. And the revision goes back to the previous Department of Labor's handbook activity. But the employment and will statement is still a critical aspect of the handbook. So I think everyone knows what the employment will statement is, but just let me quickly go over it. The employment at will is something that's true in the United States, just virtually only in the United States. It's true in all states other than Montana. And what it says is to the employee is that you're employed at will, which means you can leave whenever you want for whatever reason, good reason, bad reason. You can give us notice. You don't have to give us notice. And I know some handbooks we require 2 weeks notice. Can't do that. You have to say you're employed at will, you can leave whatever time. It would be nice if you could give us 2 weeks, but there's no obligation to do that. And so that's what you tell employees. They can do whatever they want. But you also then tell them that you get to do whatever you want. And so as long as you're not violating the law, like Title VII, or the ADA, you can tell a person they're employed or perhaps they're unemployed at any time for any reason. So if the person wears an ugly brown sweater that you don't like and say, that's it, I'm firing you, perhaps not a good reason, but you can do that. And so important part then of the handbook then is, again, stating your employment at will statement. Your handbook needs to respond to geographic diversity. And so I mentioned this earlier talking about handbooks because now we have geography playing a role in the distribution because as our organization expands, we now have we have individuals not only working in our home state, but perhaps across the country. And so we have people in California, in Washington, Oregon, and then New York, and Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, and down in Florida, and every state now has its own rules. Partly because many states feel the federal government isn't doing its role. So states are now taking upon themselves to develop their own work rules and things you need to do. So because this now has significant impact then on your handbook if you're in more than one state, and you need to think about that as you do your handbook. Also, there's questions on the limitations you place in your handbook. So as you design your handbook, as you develop your handbook, are you placing limitations on it? If you are, why are you doing that? Where are you doing it? Is it throughout the whole United States, or are you doing separate limitations for type of employment, things like that? So something to consider. And also, who can make changes to issues discussed in your handbook? As a general rule, you don't want anyone doing that, other than perhaps Human Resources Department person, perhaps with the approval of senior management. You do not want people making changes to your handbook that will then be enforced by the organization. Make sure you understand changes that occur in the handbook and limit those who can make those changes. Additionally, you need to address some other issues. So I talked earlier about wage and hour issues. This is probably the most important issue for many of your employees, is just how am I going to get paid, when am I going to get paid, what are the issues involved with that. And of course, from a policy perspective, this is one that's susceptible to changes among the states. So as you go from California to Arkansas to up to New York, you're going to find different changes in the minimum wage and the time of payment of wages and the conditions that wages get paid. And so you begin to think about, well, all right, is one handbook going to be able to address all these issues? In some cases, yes. In some cases, you're getting to the point now where you need multiple handbooks just addressing wage and hour issues. Equal pay. Of course, the equal pay law actually precedes Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and we're still talking about equal pay. I know the state of Virginia finally passed the amendment to make it a new constitutional law. Of course, we missed the target by years, but still an issue. But equal pay is an ongoing issue. Increasingly, we're seeing litigation in that issue. So you need to make sure that, first of all, your work rules do not discriminate against women or minorities, but then are equally enforced. And so an ongoing issue. Time off and leave issues. Again, another issue that's not addressed in the federal wage issue, but it's certainly among states. And again, increasingly differences among states now that you have to address. Millennials, of course, are the new entrants into the labor market, and now you need to think about, okay, well, this is how we communicated with our previous workforce. Is the workforce changing? What is their expectations? And they're not always the same, and sometimes you think people think differently about it. So it's another reason if you haven't changed your handbook, maybe you need to update it as people have left and you've hired new people and how they're interpreting your handbook. Genetic testing, typically not an issue for employers, but we have a policy statement dealing with genetic testing in the handbook, which you should have, telling employees and supervisors what the genetic testing law says and what they can do and what they can't do. LGBT issues, very important issue right now. Of course, there's Supreme Court decisions that will come out later this year on this, but you need to think about it and structure your workforce appropriately. Things like math rooms. Right now, probably most organizations have men's room and women's room. Maybe you need to change that as you go forward. Something to pay attention to as you're developing your handbook. Consensual workplace romantic relationships. Well, we talk about sex in the workplace. We know that people have relationships. Do you want to discourage it? Do you want to encourage it? Do you want to take a neutral position? Who gets to have this relationship? Can a supervisor have a sexual relationship with a subordinate? Is that allowed? So you need to think through these issues now, perhaps often that you've just ignored in the past, to make sure that your position is appropriate, but then is effectively communicated. And then cyber breaches, one that's just growing now, and seems like every day there's a discussion of cyber breaches, not necessarily employment handbook, but they're not excluded to this whole process. And so a number of things now you need to think about, perhaps that you didn't think about in the past, the creation of your employee handbook. Additionally, there is a federal law that you need to pay attention to. It's referred to as the whistleblower statute. And this law, the title of it is the Defend Trade Secrets Act of 2016, or DTSA. And what this law does is allows businesses to file a lawsuit in federal court to protect their trade secrets from unscrupulous former employees and dishonest business competitors. It should be incorporated in every contract or agreement with an employee that governs the use of trade secrets or other confidential information, and it should be increasingly discussed in the employee handbook. So if you have trade secrets, if you have confidential information, this may be another activity you want to include in your handbook, and perhaps talk to your attorneys about this to make sure that this is also included in your handbook and how you're going to react to this issue. So continuing with our discussion, so we have then is a number of things we also have to address. So we see that there's an expanding diversity of participants in the handbook development. So I talked about the development in the past few minutes, and what we talked about then is now more than just HR. I mean, that's the message. You need to think about both the individuals involved and diversity in them. And so you may want something more than the white male workforce just developing the handbook. You need to get this diversity involved in the handbook development, because this is going to be what's communicated to your employees. You need to pay greater attention to the expanding number of employee stakeholders, and I talked about that. And you need to consider new format design and new methodology of handbook distribution, including web versions. So again, this is more than just a hard copy handbook, something we still do and encourage employers to have, but you need to have, employers increasingly need to have more than just the hard copy. They need to expand their handbook to include other versions. So also then we will have to, as you doing your handbook now, as you're planning your handbook, You need to recognize you need to assess and measure the impact of the employee handbook on your employment brand and talent management activities. So now you're not just doing the handbook as an activity. You're looking to set up some perhaps goals and some expectation to see how it affects the organization. This is going to be important as you go forward. So your handbook now is not just an activity that you do and just move on. You need to measure it by certain standards, which means then you're going to be looking at how the handbook contributes to your business objectives. Again, and I've said this now a couple times, this is now an important issue. You're not just doing handbooks as a human resource activity. You're looking actually at handbooks then to contribute to business activities, business objectives. And so something you're going to be looking to measure and setting up expectations about what to measure. So just as a question, a general question, as you think of your employee handbook, when was the last time you updated it? So if you updated in the last 2 years, perhaps you've addressed many of these issues. Just recognize in some states, particularly on the East Coast and West Coast, you may have done it 2 years ago, but you probably have to do it again because California, New York, and perhaps some other states are making so many changes to the employment laws that it requires often more frequently than once a year, or at least once a year. So an issue. If it's been more than 2 years since you've addressed your handbook, you need to go back and look at it because there are changes occurring. Perhaps you're in a state that hasn't made any changes, but now with the new exempt and non-exempt status, with the new wage information, you probably need something to address those issues. And of course, you may be uncertain, or maybe you're new to your organization. You're uncertain when it happens, so you need to look at that. And maybe you don't have an employee handbook. And it used to be when we did employee handbook, we'd say, okay, the minimum is 100 employees. If you have fewer than 100 employees, you didn't need a handbook. Those days are gone. As a matter of fact, we did a handbook for a client with 7 employees, and they just felt it was important that all employees knew what was required of both of the organization and of them individually and of their supervisor. So I don't know whether you do it at 7, but certainly I think now that at 25 or more, you need to think of some type of written document, some type of employment handbook that communicates key information to employees. And of course, the larger employers need to think much more broadly about what's included in the handbook now. And for other employers with multiple locations, perhaps in multiple states, need to think about multiple handbooks. And as I'll mention in a minute, if you have your workforce is diverse and you have Spanish-speaking and other types of employees, maybe you need to put in other languages now. So the handbook itself is changing its role and its purpose. So one of the things I thought I'd share with you then is that we did a national survey of employers, and the survey was a national survey, and it ranged from size of employers with 10 employees or more to more than 200,000. And I thought I'd share with you some of the significant findings that we found from the survey reports. So one of the first things we found is there's significant disconnect between employee handbooks and their practices in implementing policy. So the vast majority of employers had handbooks, but the implementation and the purposes of the handbooks differed significantly. So the first thing we found was that we looked at the variety of methods used to communicate employment policies. And 89% used employee handbooks. 84% of the employers used written and memos and documents that gave directly to employees or posted on bulletin boards. 76% communicated orally or by having employees observe how we operate. And 59% posted electronic versions of their handbook on the web or internet site. That number is growing, 59%. So significant number of employers now have other versions of their employment handbook. We also then looked at developing policies. So 89% considered their corporate culture in drafting their handbook. I think that's probably an overestimate of the true value, because many employers haven't really considered their corporate culture in drafting handbooks. I mean, that's changing, but I think that was something they recognized perhaps they should, but they really haven't done it. 87% align their policies and procedures with strategic business, talent management, EEO, and diversity objectives. Again, I think an overestimate of what employers say they're doing. Many have not. And 75% consider external and internal factors that affect their organization's competitive position and the ability to generate revenue. This one, I'm sure that number is inflated. The vast majority of, not vast, but a significant percentage of organizations don't consider or haven't considered external and internal factors that affect their competitive position when generating their revenue. And it was just work rules and those type of things. Now that's changing and it needs to change, but something to consider as you move forward. When developing policies, we found that 89 considered their corporate culture in drafting policies. Oh, and why are we doing this again? Let's see here. So when we looked at specific purposes for issuing employee handbooks, we found that 96% use it to comply with legal obligations and requirements, 95% use it to communicate important information, 94% use it to answer routine employee questions, 88% used it to contribute to organizational orderliness, 86% to create positive employee relations, and 80% to delineate employment-related prerogatives. And then finally, to assist, 62% use it to assist in hiring and recruiting. That's also now changing. Employees are now looking for seeing a copy of the handbook, helping them make the decision. So that means now, as you think about employee handbooks, this is now for something more than employees who are your employees, but you need to think about it from a marketing perspective. Will it help you gain new employees? We also found weaknesses in that as we did handbooks. The first weakness we found was in the effectiveness and comprehensiveness of the handbook. Only 42% indicated that they assessed the effectiveness of their handbook in meeting handbook purposes and objectives. So you can see the vast majority have not done this, and part of this because is that employers never had identified what the purposes of handbook objectives were. So they had nothing to compare that to. So as that changes now, as you now look at handbooks, meeting the purposes and objectives of the organization, this is going to have to change. And only 40% discuss the written and unwritten policies and practices in their employee handbook. So something else to think of as you move forward. Okay, come on. When we looked at then, what we also found then is inconsistencies in the policy communications. So 57%, only 50% assessed the material in their handbook to ensure that their handbook material was consistent with comments and information communicated during the hiring and onboarding process. So this was typical because we only used to think about handbook when the person was hired. And so this wasn't something that even came up in many cases during the hiring and particularly under the hiring process. So that's changing now. Employers need to pay more attention to what they, as part of their hiring process, what they're communicating to their employees, and often perhaps sharing a copy of the handbook with their employees because millennials are now asking for it. 74% ensured that employees received a copy of handbook revisions. This is obviously a no-no. All employees should be 100% that when you change your handbook and you issue a revision, that you make sure that everyone gets a copy of that revision. And 78% compared the statements in their handbook with statements made on their employment application, offer letters, and personnel action forms. This is, again, a problem for many employers because during the hiring process, supervisors and managers will be involved in meeting with individuals and in an attempt to get the employee to agree to come to work with them. They may respond in a positive way to employee requests or make comments that your organization hasn't agreed to, doesn't agree to, and perhaps they make promises that they shouldn't. So this is something perhaps not only an employment handbook issue, but something you need to make sure then that people involved in the hiring process don't do. Weaknesses were also found in the handbook format and logistics. So only 54% indicated or included an issue date on the handbook. This is something you should do immediately. If you take nothing away from this webinar, include on your next handbook the issue date. So it can go in the lower left-hand corner, the lower right-hand corner, the center, in a smaller font size. You should say the issue date of the handbook. That should go on every page, from the front page to the last page. You should show the issue date. So something that's to be aware of. And only 61% included a revision date. So where you revise a page of a currently have a current handbook. So you have your date issued, and then you have above that the revision date. Both dates should be included then on those pages that have been revised. And so make sure you do that. And only 63% regularly reviewed and assessed the handbook's format, design, and method of distribution to determine the effectiveness. So this is an ongoing issue. So again, you're doing the hard copy, but you may need to think about other ways of ensuring that your employees have the most current and accurate information, so they will know what comes next. When we looked at the handbook development, we found that was behind closed doors. Only 55% of them indicate that managers and supervisors previewed the handbook before it was issued. So as I mentioned, now when we do handbooks, we have meetings not only with senior executives, CEO and CFO, but with managers and supervisors. They get a chance to look at the handbook and provide comments about things that perhaps should be changed, should be included, an important part then in this development process. But additionally, we're finding that so 55%, that factor is growing now. The employers are doing that. But very few have had employees review the handbook. It's something now we encourage employers to do. So as you're getting ready, if you've gone through this process, you're getting close to the final version, call in a sample group, a focus group of employees, 5 to 10 employees, give them a copy of the handbook and say, okay, here's a new handbook coming out. Tell us about it. What's good, what's bad, what's missing, what's included that perhaps shouldn't be, what don't you understand. Very useful. And what we've found is that often topics that supervisors, managers missed, that employees pay attention to, weren't discussed. In some cases, there was some confusion. In some cases, there was something that the handbook was saying that the employees were telling us that supervisors and managers don't do. And so that required some additional analysis. So very valuable activity now to include before you issue your final version of your new handbook, that you get some employees, I wouldn't say more than 10, but have them look at the handbook and give you their comments. We also found it had a positive impact on stakeholders. but this was limited. So survey participants were asked whether or not their employee handbook created a positive image and a favorable impression of their organization with various stakeholders. So 74% said it had a favorable impact on employees. So this is some employees saying, yeah, I got the handbook good. You don't know the accurate number, but hopefully it would be more than 75%, but that's what we were told. 85% thought it had a positive impact on supervisors. Well, that seems possible because supervisors, at least if not involved in the development, at least have some guidance on things that for work rules that were positive for them, at least that they could enforce. So that's perhaps reasonable. Surprisingly, 29% said it had a positive impact on stockholders and investors. This is interesting because stockholders and investors now are looking at handbooks, looking at what employers are doing and managing their workforce, and that's not necessarily a positive feature. Of course, I'm not sure we don't have any way of telling what the figure should be, but we would think stockholders and investors in a company would have a more positive impression of the handbook than they're currently looking at. So something to pay attention to. 61% said it had a positive impact on insurance carriers. So those particularly for employment practice, if you have employment practice liability insurance, this is an issue. They're going to want a copy of your handbook. Maybe they don't always agree. I mean, they're looking at it from a standpoint of a liability perspective, but an issue. 66% told us that DEOC, the DOL, and government agencies had a positive impression of their handbook. Okay, I mean, it's hard to tell what the accurate figure should be, but that seems to be a figure we can deal with. And then only 54% said that it had a positive effect on courts and juries. And, of course, that means you're in a trial. You're showing part of the handbook that benefits your issue. The plaintiff's attorney will be showing part of your handbook that has a positive impact on them. So your handbook now is being divided into various parts. So this may be the best you can get, but it's just interesting. The various individuals who have an impact on are affected by your handbook. Once the handbook was issued, organizations moved on to other issues. So only 64% ensured that the handbook recognized and responded to changes in the organizational structure, location, and operations. And this is an important issue now because more than many organizations are going through change. They're changing organizational structure. They're perhaps adding locations, closing locations, changing operations. You need to make sure then that your handbook recognizes and responds to those changes. 51% ensured the handbook was still responsive to a changing workforce. So as you're going through all these other changes, your workforce is changing. And, of course, we mentioned millennials. So you need to say, okay, does the handbook still respond to our current workforce? Is it responsive to our changing workforce, our new workforce? And that may cause you to at least reconsider your handbook in the way you've done it. And only 11% followed up with employees to determine if their organization policies answered routine questions. This is discouraging. After you have your handbook should not just be something you issue and then you don't pay attention again to it until the next time you do it. After you issue your handbook, maybe in 30 or 60 days, talk to some employees. Maybe call another focus group and say, okay, the handbook was out. What do you think? Positive, negative. What are the good features? What are the bad features? I think this communication with employees will have an added feature, and from your perspective, as a manager's perspective, in encouraging employee participation and the value that they place in the organization. Handbooks were written for the moment, so only 47% considered future organizational needs and emerging issues when drafting their handbook. So as I mentioned, Many organizations now are going through changes, having changes anticipated, acquiring new sites, new products, new employment, getting rid of old employment, merging and acquiring new business. You need to think about that as you develop your handbook. Because it's going to be an important issue for compliance with key work rules, let alone laws. And then what I thought I'd show you is just some handbook topics, category handbook topics, and how often they're included. So 98% said they include a sexual harassment policy. 96% said they have an EEO policy. I'm not sure why the difference, but because typically the sexual handbook policy is part of the EEO statement. 92% had policy and procedures. And this is an important statement. This goes into the front of the handbook. So you need a statement that says the policy, practice, procedures, and benefits may be changed at any time at the sole discretion of the organization. So this is where you're telling your employees that we have these work rules and policies and procedures, but we can change them at any time. And you want to make sure that that goes in the front of your handbook. This is going to be the legalistic part of your handbook where you make this statement. 92% had a drug-free workplace, and of course, if you're a federal contractor, you need to have a drug-free workplace. Of course, now that means perhaps you're looking at marijuana and how that affects your handbook, because from a federal perspective, it doesn't, because under federal law, it's still prohibited, but now states have passed marijuana laws that allow individuals to use marijuana, and so you want to make sure that's a discussion now you need to include in your handbook. Employment at will statement. So this is another statement that goes up front in the handbook saying, here's our employment at will statement, and you want to communicate that to the employees. A statement the handbook is not a contract. Another upfront statement saying that this is not a contract. You have the right to leave any time, and we have the right to separate you any time. We have the right to change this at any time. Statement concerning the organization's use of computers, electronic equipment, and emails, 91%. Statement, a discussion of wages, hours, and overtime, 91% had that. FMLA policy, 91%. And of course, if the FMLA policy applies to you, meaning you have more than 50 employees, you need that has to be in the handbook. Complaint procedures, 88%. A statement concerning the use of the organization's property, 85% had that. Code of ethics, a statement concerning the organization's commitment to legal compliance. As I mentioned, this is something you're required to have if you're a publicly traded company. So something to pay attention to. A discussion of the organization's history, mission, culture, and values. This is the piece that goes in the front of the handbook from the organization's president or CEO, welcoming people to the organization, more narrative, more different type of, welcome to the organization. I'm glad you're here. This is what we do. This is what our expectations. It shouldn't be more than a page or two, but it's a way of introducing perhaps your CEO or the president of the organization to your employees to create that relationship. Confidentiality information, 80%. Statement of organization's employee relations, 75%. A listing of offenses that would subject employees to 70% to disciplinary action. 70%. This is a real surprise. This is one feature, or one of the features we expect very high in the 90s that employers would have, and you should have then this listing of areas of violation that could cause disciplinary action. In some cases, it'll be a warning. Some cases, it'll be a verbal warning. Some cases, a written warning. Some cases, it'll be disciplinary action, including termination. But you should have that. So it was surprising that not more employers had a discussion of disciplinary action. The statement concerning organization's right to search, desk lockers, 68%. Statement concerning or indicating that who had the authority to enter into the relationship and make any changes. Again, this goes up front. And it should be clear that only the president has that ability to make changes, and it has to be in writing. And then a statement concerning labor relations. I know the vast majority of you do not have labor relations, but I think a paragraph is useful and covering your position. Only 46% had that. So then to increase, as we finish this part of the presentation, to increase the effectiveness of your employment policies, enhance your business, operational, and legal intelligence to ensure that you have identified changing external and internal factors affecting those policies. So this is before you start your handbook. Make sure you sat down and with other individuals and identify these key issues, things that you have the expectation that you need to address, that you have the expectation that you're going to change or perhaps modify or add to your handbook. You should beginning to put those in writing so you can identify that you do your handbook. Increase internal stakeholder participation in the handbook development to obtain greater employee commitment and operational alignment. So as I mentioned, it should be more than just a human resource person. Establishing metrics to assess the policy, so you should have metrics that are used now to measure your handbook development and process. You need to implement internal controls to alert managers when there's a failure in an employee process, a handbook process. So this is something that you need to do.